everyone. I am Laura Olson. I am currently the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And we were very sad this year to have to cancel our annual meeting due to the COVID pandemic. But what we've been able to do is organize a series of Fall Friday panels. This is the third of our 3 Fall Friday panels. And today what we have is an extremely exciting treat about, as I just said, something that is incredibly timely and about which we don't know a whole lot yet. And that is the place of religion in the 2020 elections. Obviously, we don't know right now when we're recording this event, we don't know formally who the winner of the presidential election will be. And we're still waiting on a few congressional races as well. But we will proceed with the information that we have and use sort of the both empirical knowledge that we have gained over many years, as well as the theory that we've developed over many years as well, to sort of think about putting religion into the context of what we know so far about the results of the 2020 election. I am so pleased today to have 3 panelists who have so much to add to this conversation. First, we have Elizabeth Sciupac from the Pew Research Center. Second, we have Michele Margolis from the University of Pennsylvania. And third, we have Gerardo Martí from Davidson College. And so what I'd like to do is turn it over first to Elizabeth, then to Michele, then to Gerardo. And then what we can do is open it up. I may have some questions, and you all in the audience may also ask questions in the Q&A feature that you see at the bottom middle, the right-hand part of the middle bottom of your screen. So first, let me welcome you, Elizabeth. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. I'm really excited to be here to be talking about all of this. And I really appreciate you all having me. I'm going to share a few slides here, so let me just pull those up. Bear with me for just one moment. Here we go. I know that this is about the 2020 election, and I promise that I can follow instructions, but I want to set the stage just a little bit and talk briefly about kind of the context in what we know about how religious voters vote, so to speak. And so what I want to do is kind of step back first and look at the 2016 election here. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but what this chart shows is validated voters from 2016. It's a little bit different than the exit polls because this data is from our, like I said, our verified voter data set, in which our researchers matched Pew Research Center's nationally representative American Trends panel with voter files. And so that said, the story that we see here is relatively consistent with past presidential elections and with a lot of what we know about 2016. You can see here that the vast majority of white evangelical Protestants voted for Donald Trump. And on the very right-hand side here, you see that they made up about 20% or so of the electorate. White Protestants who are not evangelical, they're labeled as mainline on this chart, and white Catholics, all non-Hispanic, also favored Trump. And they made up about roughly equal shares of the electorate in 2016, that 14% there. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics who voted heavily for Hillary Clinton. You see 96% of Black Protestants voted for Clinton, 78% of Hispanic Catholics, but they made up much smaller shares of the electorate there, that's 7%, 5%. And we also see, of course, among the religiously unaffiliated, those who are atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. I might refer to them as the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. I like to spell it out the first time just in case. That among the religiously unaffiliated, about 2/3 voted for Clinton, and the group as a whole made up about 1/4 of the electorate. So I say all this because the past is certainly not always a prediction of the future, but we did see a very similar story in our pre-election polling in 2020 about how these groups were leaning. So again, I really want to stress that this is pre-election polling. It is not meant to be predictive. This survey was conducted in early October, which sometimes seems like it was a lifetime ago. And this is all based on registered voters. But what we see here is that as of early October, about 52% of registered voters said they would vote for Biden or lean toward Biden if the election were held today. 42% said the same about Trump. But there are these racial and religious divisions that we can also see here. And here, white Christians kind of stand out from these other groups. What we see here is very similar to what we saw in the voting patterns of 2016, that white evangelical Protestants, the majority, vast majority, said that they would vote for Trump if the election were held today. You also see about half of white Catholics and white Protestants who are not evangelical saying the same thing. At the same time, among these groups who are not white Christians, these unaffiliated subgroups, Jewish voters, Hispanic Catholics, Black Protestants, they all tilted, not just tilted, are balanced toward voting for Biden. If the election were held today as in early October, all of these groups to varying degrees said that they would vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. I will say this other category, in this particular question, we did ask about Jorgensen and Hawkins, and you can see the shares there on the far right of who said they would vote for them. Now these vote choices are really largely reflective of just partisan identification. It's not altogether surprising that this is the way the chips are falling, because we know that there are these really long-term trends of how religious groups identify by party ID. And what we see here, these same kind of breaks, these white Christian groups on this slide, that white evangelical Protestants heavily identify as Republican or say that they lean toward the Republican Party. White Catholics have grown more Republican over time, or increasingly identified rather with the Republican Party. And even among white Protestants who are not evangelical, about 54% say that they identify with or lean toward the GOP. And like the other slides, we see that these other groups tend to identify far more with the Democratic Party. Some of those trends are longstanding and relatively stable. Black Protestants, you see about 8 in 10 over the course of the past couple decades have identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party. Among Jews, party identification has also been relatively stable, but you also see some increases. You see that the unaffiliated have become more likely to identify with the Democratic Party over time, slightly more, but still some movement there. And I'll end it just on a couple more slides, talking not necessarily about vote choice, but about job approval, because a lot of that does play into if you know, how do you decide who to vote for and who approves of Trump, of how Donald Trump is handling his job as president. And we see, again, these very similar patterns of white Christians and everyone else. So what we're looking at here is not just registered voters, and it is a little bit earlier of a time frame. So we're looking at an July-August poll here as the endpoint. But we do see that about half or more of these white Christian groups, white Catholics, white Protestants who are not evangelical, and white evangelical Protestants, half or more, you know, say that they do approve of how Trump is handling his job. And there has been some movement in there, but it's still half or more of these groups. And that stands out. It stands out from the other groups that we talked about because you see much lower ratings among Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, Jews, atheists and agnostics, and those who say their religion is nothing in particular. You don't see any more than about a third of any of these groups saying that they approve of how Trump is handling his job as of late August. And again, there's some movement, there's some changes, but it's a very stark contrast when we start to compare white Christians with these other groups. And a lot of that, like I said, it's not just these approval ratings, it's not just party identification, it's how they said that they were going to vote, and it's how we've seen these groups vote in past presidential elections. So with that kind of context in place, I will stop sharing and I will pass it over to Michele.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I forgot to unmute. Thank you.
All right, am I ready?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, let me do my screen share. And then okay, so I could not have asked for a better setup than what Elizabeth gave me. So that was perfect. So in addition to, there's a lot of things I want to talk about, but I also want to be cognizant of the time so that we have lots of time for discussion and Q&A. But what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is the exit poll data, specifically from Georgia and Pennsylvania. So I actually work on NBC's decision desk calling races. And so what that means is, in addition to being incredibly tired right now, I actually have access to the 2020 exit poll data, which I know some of it has come out publicly, but what I decided to do is I thought I'd focus on two key races and pull some crosstabs that regular media outlets wouldn't really focus on, but that folks who are interested in religion and politics might care about. So first, this is the Georgia electorate. The far left panel is just the percent of the electorate that is white evangelical. So 32%, so about a third of the electorate from this election cycle was identified as white evangelical. White is their own self-identification, and evangelicals from the exit poll that asks, do you consider yourself an evangelical or born again Christian? So for context, white evangelicals made up about 34% of the Georgia electorate in 2016 and 2018. So it's about on par from those, but there had been a decrease from 2014. So just giving everything a little bit of context. Among white voters, I can call them voters, we know that from the exit poll. Among white voters, about 55% of them identify as evangelical. So that's what that second column is kind of the breakdown among white voters, what percent are evangelical and not. And then the latter two columns do the exact same thing for the Black voters in Georgia. So 16% of the entire Georgia electorate are Black evangelicals, people who identify as Black and as an evangelical or born again Christian. And then among African Americans, 52% say they identify as an evangelical, 48% don't. So that's going to be sort of our kind of baseline that we're going to move off of. And then you'll see under kind of useful context, which will come up on the next slide, about 27% of the sample, or in this, the exit poll sample, are white, but don't consider themselves evangelical Christians. So they're about slightly less than the white evangelical sample, but still a sizable number. Okay, so these are the voting patterns from Georgia from this election. So the far left is just the Georgia vote, 49-49, have to say, pretty spot on. The second column, and for your context, because I actually didn't remember the exact outcome, 2016, Trump won 50.4 to Clinton's 45.3. So that's where we were at. The second column is the breakdown that represents 60% of the sample. This is just white Georgians. The third column, which we might care more about, is this 32% of the sample. These are the white evangelicals. And here we see 85% voted for Trump, 14% voted for Biden. You might say, oh, 81% of white evagelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016, so Trump actually got more. But that 81% statistic is actually for the national average. In what I could find from 2016 is that 92% of white evangelicals in Georgia voted for Donald Trump. So there was actually a slight decrease, at least in Georgia. This is a really important statistic that I think is super interesting, and I want to come back to it in a bit, is that this 27% of the sample, these white non-evangelicals, so they are white, they are not evangelicals, they look like the overall Georgia population. They're 49-49. They were evenly split in voting for Trump or Biden. And then the latter two columns, we have Black evangelicals and Black non-evangelicals, both not surprisingly, overwhelmingly voted for Biden. I don't know if you guys can see my little mouse or not, but what I think is super important about this group is they're going to be moving forward, I think, very instrumental as from a persuasion standpoint of who's going to be able to win Georgia. So obviously Georgia is going to be a lot of souls to the polls. Getting white evangelicals are coming out for the Republican candidate, Black evangelicals coming out for the Democratic candidate. But if you do some back of the envelope calculations, you can see here that the white evangelical population is slightly a larger part of the electorate, 32%, than the Black electorate, but that the Black voters gave Biden a higher rate of votes than white evangelicals. So basically they netted, Donald Trump from white evangelicals netted about the same number of votes
as Biden netted from African Americans. And so what does that mean? It means that this group in the middle, this 49-49, is going to be crucial in deciding who ends up winning Georgia in 2020. And maybe not surprising that this is 49-49, that this is 49-49, if we think that this number and these numbers basically net out. Okay, so that's Georgia. What does the future have in store for Georgia? I broke out the same data just based on age. This is completely consistent with existing research that we have, which shows that white evangelicals are aging. So this white evangelical, and I'm sorry if I'm going fast, I can always go back to slides if you want more time on them. You can see that this white evangelical group is disproportionately older and underrepresented in the younger age categories relative to the state as a whole. This is the distribution of ages as the state. Interestingly, you see a similar pattern for Black evangelicals, that Black evangelicals are also on average older, meaning that younger evangelicals are less likely to adopt that label of evangelical or born again Christian. And there's lots of reasons why we think that's the case. But importantly, this doesn't have the same political consequences, because we know that Black evangelicals and Black non-evangelicals supported Biden at roughly similar rates. But the fact that there are going to be a shrinking number of white evangelicals in the Georgia electorate is going to matter a great deal. This is something that many people have written about, most recently Robbie Jones, right? I'm going to skip over this, but for people who are interested, I have how people voted in Georgia, right? Because they had in-person early, vote by mail, and election day. And then I did some attitudes. We have attitudes on abortion, most important issue, COVID priority, and favorability. So anyone interested in those, we can come back to them. But I want to switch. I don't want to take up too much time, and I want to talk about Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, this is the religious breakdown, both for the entire state, for white Pennsylvanians and for non-white Pennsylvanians. Important to remember that Pennsylvania, I need to remind myself, Pennsylvania is 88% white. I forget that because I live in the city of Philadelphia, which is 55% Black. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that the state is actually very overwhelmingly white. So this is a small number of people. But Pennsylvania, so we're going to be focusing, and I thought what would be interesting is talking about evangelicals in the Georgia context, but talking about Catholics and non-identifiers, or the NONEs, as Elizabeth said, in Pennsylvania. So just for useful context, Catholics make up 24% of Pennsylvania, and 21% are unaffiliated, according to recent Pew data. So that means that Catholics are slightly overrepresented in the Pennsylvania electorate, and non-identifiers are slightly underrepresented. These are the voting patterns. All right, so we have the entire state, again, 49-49. Here's our 2016 outcome, right? Again, very, very close. I think that this will actually be off by, I think Biden will end up winning by more like 1 or 2 percentage points, but I think it's reasonable to say that it's very close. This is the breakdown for the white Pennsylvanians. Again, this is it, which is 86% of this sample of the electorate, Trump winning 55-43. This is the white Catholic vote. Trump won 60% of the white Catholic vote. Again, the non-white Catholic vote, consistent with everything Elizabeth said, is flipped. Again, this is a very small percentage of the Pennsylvania sample, but I will use this as my hill to die on, which is we should not talk about the Catholic vote. The Catholic vote is a combination of a white group that's very disproportionately Republican and a non-white group that is disproportionately Democrat. And so when we talk about, is the Catholic vote a swing group, the answer is no. It just depends on the relative sizes of the two groups that make it up that aren't swinging all that much. So I will soapbox rant over. And then the non-identifiers here, they made up 15% of the voters in Pennsylvania. And again, consistent with the Pew predictions, overwhelmingly went for Biden, about 3-1. What does the future have in store for Pennsylvania? Again, this comports with with research that's already out there, that the white Catholic population percentage is disproportionately older, right? We have only 6% are in this younger category compared to 12% of the state as a whole. And you have 46% and 28% respectively in the 45 to 64 and 65 plus, which is slightly higher, much higher than the Pennsylvania average for the 45 to 64, and a bit in the oldest as well. But we can see here that we expect the share of non-identifiers to increase over time. They're disproportionately younger. in the 18 to 29 and the 30 to 44 age categories. So we're going to expect to see, assuming that trends stay the same as far as religious affiliation, that we're going to expect to see this 15% of at least Pennsylvania, but we could say this across the board, that the share of the electorate of religious non-identifiers is going to go up. And then this is, I'll skip this because I don't want to take more time, but this I thought was an interesting, they had a question on the Pennsylvania exit poll asking whether you were voting for your candidate or against the opposing candidate. So I'm happy to talk about that during Q&A if people are interested. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. We have a question in the Q&A actually for you that deals with the what the situation might look like in suburban Philadelphia. And so if you have just a few words that you might like to say about that while we're in that context.
Any thoughts on the suburbs? Suburbs of Pittsburgh, traditionally blue, are overwhelmingly red. So the Philadelphia suburbs have been moving more and more blue. I don't know how it's going to play out exactly in this election, but at least when I was looking at the data coming in, thinking about like Montgomery County, Delaware County, those sorts of neighboring areas to Philadelphia, there's definitely been a shift, and I think that that's going to be part of Biden's success in the state. Like turnout in Philadelphia is not actually as high as folks wanted it to be, but what they are seeing is enough swings in the non-cities that, when you're talking about when you lost the election in 2016 by, 20,000 votes or whatever it was, that it's not going to be that getting those swings of a few thousand votes here and there across the state. We see that in Luzerne. We did see that a bit in Allegheny, but I think we're seeing it in Bucks and Montgomery counties as well. But yeah.
Great, thank you. There are a few other questions in the Q&A that are primarily geared toward you. So if you would like, well, I would like to turn it over to Gerardo, but Michelle, if you would like to take a look in the Q&A, if there are some questions that you would feel comfortable responding to by typing, that'd be great. So our final speaker is Gerardo Martí. Welcome, Gerardo.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share a few things. Also, I'm inspired by my colleagues. And I assume you can see this Pew Research Growing Shares of White Christians. And so one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is I want to talk about white evangelicals and put them into sort of a more cultural perspective for those interested in religion. And also then want to talk a little bit about at least Latinos and Latinx community, and then perhaps even speculate about the future of African Americans and religion and politics. So one of the things that I think should be familiar with now is that white Christians have definitely believed that they have been winning politically and that this has fed into their support for Donald Trump. And so we can see this real interesting rise from 2016 to 2020. And it wasn't just among white evangelicals, it was also white Protestants who aren't evangelical and also white Catholics. So this widespread sense that white Christians are doing well under the Trump presidency certainly fed into their vote. And we've paid attention more to white evangelical Protestants because they're so interesting, and because the overwhelming majority of them really do believe that they've been doing well. And it's in particular this notion that they believe that Trump fights for what they believe in. All right, so how well does fights for what I believe in describe Donald Trump? 81% of white evangelicals responded in that way. And so Donald Trump has been seen as a fighter. I've written about this because it's so compelling, and it's something that continues to come through over and over again, both through the data and as well as an abundance of anecdotal data that we have through the social media, the media that is portrayed, books that have been written in support of Donald Trump, and more. The most famous tweet, and the one that I find to be most iconic, is Jerry Falwell in 2018 when he said, "Conservatives and Christians need to stop electing nice guys. They might make great Christian leaders, but the US needs street fighters like Donald Trump at every level of government because the liberal fascist Dems are playing for keeps and many Republican leaders are a bunch of wimps." That attitude continues to persist even through the presidential debates, in which some people felt that Trump may have been a bully, a little bit too pushy. But I read a very compelling post by a white evangelical Republican who said, look, we're in a war. This is a war, you know, and we're not playing for marbles here. It's life or death. And so that sense of being willing to advance that to the degree at which whatever is needed will be done politically is acceptable within that framework. But it also is that it's not about the distaste for Donald Trump himself. It used to be that we would say, well, it's really about the support of the policy and not the person. And even I'm guilty of that particular line. But in actuality, what we see is an overwhelming support for Trump as a person that has accompanied support for his policies and the things that he believes in. And so only white Christians support, say in a majority, that Donald Trump is intelligent, that he's honest, that he's morally upstanding, and that he fights for what I believe in. That's from February of early this year. The AP VoterCast survey that we have just in the last day or so would say exactly the same thing. You can see a completely opposite assessment about the moral quality of each of these candidates based on the response. And so would you say Donald Trump is honest and trustworthy? Those who voted for Trump, 97% would say absolutely. And so these, I think, dovetail when we think about religion into other things that seem to orient around the aura of Trump and his charisma, if you will. And one of the most interesting points of data is from Paul Jupe, who gives us this earlier this year to think about the idea of the president as being anointed. And what he shows is that the belief in presidential anointment has increased with Trump. In fact, it's sort of supercharged by Trump. And the more frequently you attend religious services, the higher your assessment of this very thing. So there is a sacred quality to Trump. Many of you may have seen this viral image of Jesus, a ghostly image of Jesus putting his arms around Trump, apparently holding his hand as he signs a piece of legislature there in the Oval Office. And here what I see is sort of this sacred anointing of Trump in his executive office. In other words, as his role in using the powers of the presidency, the power of the state, in order to enact the initiatives and the things that they think are right. And so this is where we see a very intriguing mix between the personal charisma of Donald Trump and the ability to use the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, and that the legitimation of Trump in his charismatic authority to use the leverage of the bureaucracy of the state in order to enact initiatives that they cannot have happen in any other way. And so white evangelicals have really given up on revival or conversion as a means for social change. They now, I think that basically they've abandoned that and now believe that the only real way in which they can affect their change or have their preferences put in place is really by using the authority of the state. And this image I used to show just in terms of Jesus in the MAGA hat, and people used to laugh, but it's actually become a sort of a rallying cry. And so this was taken in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a couple of hours before a Trump event, just a week ago. And so this sense of Jesus being fully 100% behind the candidacy, the policy, the attitudes, the ethos of Trump and Trumpism certainly is there. And that gives us a sense not only for the support for the vote, but also gives us a sense of the momentum for Trumpism that may very well continue for a very long time. And so In God We Trump seems to be the sense in which there's a deep intertwining of how these things are working together. And so while some people want to make a difference between the religious orientation versus the politics of the situation, more and more, I think people are persuaded, rightly so, that evangelicalism and this kind of melding of the Republican Party with the religious imperatives of white Christians is really more of a political orientation more so than a religious orientation. There's a lot of work to be done conceptually there, but I think that we cannot simply say that the religion that they have somehow lives up here and the politics lives down here. They are all deeply intertwined. And I also think that there's a deep history there to trace that. And of course, I've written about that. So when we say Make America Great Again, what is it that we're really orienting around? This is again AP VoterCast survey showing that white Christians, Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, other Christian, well, Christians, but most of these are white, voted for Trump. So Christian support for Trump remains in this election cycle. And you can see that white evangelicals, when they're broken out, still come out very high at 81%. And then as church attendance goes up, you see that the support for Trump also goes up, consistent with what we've known. Now, where is the place of race? We're trying to discern where whiteness works within white evangelicalism. At least that's been the thing that I've been spending most of my time on in recent years. And you can see it here in another exit survey. I realize that there are problems with this, but it's indicative of something. And I think it's worth talking about because it's so consistent with what we've seen elsewhere. The first is your opinion of the Black Lives Matter movement favorable or unfavorable? You can see that vote Trumpers overwhelmingly see the Black Lives Matter movement as unfavorable. And that seems to correlate also with support for things like crime and safety, that kind of thing. Is racism in the US, is it the most important problem or one of many important problems, or is it a minor problem or not a problem at all? Again, we see radical differences in terms of the vote. And so those who vote for Trump really do not see racism as an issue. We fold white evangelicals into that support. Then do you think the country's criminal justice system treats all people fairly, or it treats Black people unfairly? Again, radical difference in assessments about the criminal justice system and its treatment towards Black Americans. In particular, what we see here, I think, is indicative of where you fall on the issues of systemic racism and even things like your attitude towards the use of critical race theory. So this is again borne out with other data. This is AP VoterCast survey, whereas the other was New York Times. Again, serious problem is racism in society, either serious or not serious. Again, the vote shakes out predictably between Trump and Biden. So when we look at these kinds of racialized attitudes in relation to Donald Trump, what we have is something that we need to figure out here that gives us some sense of a few hot takes in relation to where we fall on these things. And so what I would share here is, I think that the data that we have so far shows that President Trump remains seen as a fighter among things that conservative white Christians care most about: overturning abortion in the courts, protecting capitalism as the God-intended American way, repudiation of systemic racism as a legitimate concern, and an unbound belief in American exceptionalism, which makes all of these true. I think that the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett told conservative Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, that giving them power reliably delivers on their desires, and they trust their political representatives to fight for that tooth and nail as needed. For many, it's a war, and they see Trump as key to their winning. This is playing out in terms of the legal battles that are going to happen in relation to the elections in the states and how close they are. Also, particular emphasis now, I think, is needed with Latinx or Latino evangelicals. Because as the Latinx evangelical, mostly Pentecostal population surges, I think that the politics among the Latinx community becomes more politically conservative. The distinction of religious affiliation here is important because many have missed just how many of Latinos have moved out of Catholicism into no religion or into some form of Protestantism. The majority are moving into Protestantism, and it's a devoted, fervent Pentecostalism that takes on the affinities of the religious right. There's been much talk of correcting that in South Florida. We have Cuban Americans. Yes, Cuban Americans are the most conservative of all Latino Americans. That's certainly been true for a very long time. But when you look at other data that I've been able to see in part from something that I looked at just over the last couple of days, there seems to be an important distinction to be made between the general Latino community and the Latinos who have become Protestant. And there seems to be an affinity that occurs by aligning with Protestantism. Part of it is because Latino Protestants are very committed to their congregations. Congregations need money in order to survive. Money comes through networks and affiliations. And what Latino Protestants are doing is that they are finding their way into networks or denominations that are white dominant. Those white dominant denominations and networks are ones that are also feeding a sort of package of attitudes about how to relate to the world, and that includes their politics. Yes, some of that resonates with what we already know in conservatism about abortion, conservatism about family attitudes, conservatism in relation to LGBTQ kinds of issues. But I do think that there is a surge, and that surge of Protestantism is aligning with a surge in affinity towards the religious right. Of course, for conservative white Christians, their vote is a key way for them to enter world affairs and influence society. I think they see it as a religious act. We've seen some things of people praying in front of these election offices that is a manifestation of that. And at the same time, they give an unquestioned discretion for the concrete actions and policies that their representatives take to advance their interests. So in a sense, politics for conservative Christians occupies a sort of sacred realm. It's beyond everyday ethics, which allows for seemingly objectionable tactics to be legitimated as ultimately good. Look forward to more conversation together.
Thank you ever so much, Gerardo. One thing, I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator of this conversation. I'm lucky to be the moderator of this great conversation, and bring up one point and link it to a question that I'd like to pull out of the Q&A list of questions for you. And it's for Gerardo primarily, but our other panelists should feel free to weigh in as well. I read something in the New York Times about a week ago that's really stuck with me. It was in an op-ed written by a novelist talking about how he's seen his relatively rural community change over the last, let's say, 5+ years. And one of the things that this writer said was he called attention to the fact that Trump supporters so often, instead of signs, have flags. Right, which is something that, right, the idea of a flag symbolically, culturally, like that had not dawned on me. You know, we don't see, I guess now there are some Biden flags, copycat flags or whatever, but the writer in the Times said, what is a flag if not something that you put before you as you go into battle? Right, and so there's this, right, and that comports well with Donald Trump Jr., I guess last night said that his dad should go to absolute war, whatever the quote is in Twitter, to win the election, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this good versus evil, right? Need for war, need for, going all the way to the wall. And we have a question here from John Hawthorne, who is asking, he says, I'd like the speakers to speak to the unique role of the Paula White wing of the charismatic movement, which of course fits well with what you were just talking about, Gerardo. He says, it seems that while most evangelicals are simply following partisan ideology, and I think we would all agree that party ID, because it's become so tribal, right? Because it's become an identity, not just something like a brand loyalty, right? That's a big piece of what's going on. But and also concerns about religious freedom, which we could talk about as well. Something very different is going on in the spiritual warfare segment of the evangelical world.
Well, yes, I'll just start real quick and say that the prosperity gospel that has emerged since the 1960s is something that resonated right away with the affinity towards a neoliberal orientation towards the economy. In other words, as things became more individualized, and as Christians had already crafted a pro-capitalist message among Christians, prosperity theology also isolates the individual and their ego. It says, trust God, and in trusting God, then you also throw yourself into the world and you have confidence that it's going to work out. But what is never questioned within prosperity theology is the economic system that we have in the United States. So it becomes a full-throated support for the capitalist system, which tends to favor asset-based wealth. And prosperity theology really encourages people to see themselves as entrepreneurs who will enter into the marketplace to build up their capital and then wisely invest the capital of themselves and of their resources to enact further wealth. Now, yes, the individual's involved. You don't just play the lottery and expect that God's going to do something, but it's very interesting that it is an individual that is to take on the risk, and it's the individual that's supposed to trust. All of those things deeply resonate with the kinds of economic imperatives that are characterized by white Christian libertarianism and is inherent to what I see in white Christianity in support for Trump.
Elizabeth or Michele, would you like to weigh in on that point? Just want to give you the opportunity. Okay, cool. Let's find a question for one of the two of you. How about this one? How do you think these trends and religion contribute to polarization or reflect polarization in the United States? Especially around identity is what this person's talking about. Religion, does religion drive polarization, or does it reflect polarization, or a little bit of both?
I guess I'll take that. I mean, I think the answer is it's really messy and it's going in all directions. And so I would make the argument that, religious people are going to battle for their religious beliefs, and that's affecting their politics. I would also very strongly make the argument that people's politics are shaping their religious views and their religious communities. And regardless of the direction in which you think that this is happening, we end up in a world where we can think about Liliana Mason's work, which is not about religion, but is very important to this, which is just that when your identities become too combined, like that they become what she calls mega identities. So it's not when I insult an evangelical, I'm not just insulting their evangelical identity, I'm insulting their Republican identity, I'm insulting their white identity or their Southern identity, that there's all these other components of their identity that are all wrapped up together, that when you are being praised on one dimension or criticized on one dimension, you're actually being criticized on multiple dimensions, or you're being praised on multiple dimensions. And that's gonna produce this polarization, because you're not having cross-cutting identities where you see an affinity or a connection with people who are different from you on certain dimensions, that the people who are different from you on all sorts of dimensions. So it's easier to other those folks and to see that your insiders are not just, these are my co-patriots in faith, these are my co-patriots in politics and race and views about gender or whatever it is. And so that when the more you have in common with your in-group and the less you have in common with your out-group, that's just going to feed the polarization, because the out-group is going to look like something you have absolutely nothing in common with. So I think that regardless of whether we think it's politics affecting religion or religion affecting politics, we end up in this world of these combined mega identities, and that's really bad for kind of normative democracy.
Very, very bad, yeah.
I would add on to that, just kind of as an example, because I think you're right. I think a lot of this, which comes first, and does it actually matter at that point once you're already polarized to this end? But some of the really interesting things that we've been able to analyze in terms of that kind of partisanship and religion really shows up in our Catholic data, and we have a number of posts on this that talk about Catholics, especially. It shows up that they're very divided along these party lines, like even more than they are along religious lines. That, for example, kind of on abortion, which is obviously not, Catholic. The Catholic position is typically anti-abortion, but that Catholic partisanship is more aligned with party than with their religious teachings on that. So if you're a Catholic Democrat, then you are more likely to say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. If you're a Catholic Republican, you're more likely to say that it should be illegal in all or most cases. So you are seeing, we haven't really been able to do this for all religious groups at this point, although I think it would be very interesting, but we do see these kind of examples that this partisanship break in religious groups is very stark on a lot of these issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kari Brown has asked a question about polling. It seems like this is something with some experts in polling. Are there systematic, and this is, I suppose, a broader concern, of course, beyond just the context of religion. Do we have any sense that there might be some sort of systematic challenge going on in the polling business, given everything that we've seen the last few days? Or is that not something that you're wanting to talk about at this point? Is there a lack of representativeness, or is there something else going on in polling? Or do we not know?
Elizabeth, do you want to take this one?
I will touch on this briefly because I think we've been dealing with this non-response for a while. This is not necessarily new to this election. It's not necessarily new to all that. I think we see, particularly in this election, why a lack of representation matters. It certainly matters a lot around if there are groups that we are missing. It certainly matters and is very glaring in some of these cases. But we've been dealing with, not just we, Pew, but we in general, as in polling, have been dealing with kind of a non-response or lower response rates and things in general for a while. And there are constant efforts, I think, to increase that representativeness. There is a lot that can be done with weighting. There's also different things that would have been tried with just different modes. Some of what we've done, or what we've been trying to do recently, is for some bigger surveys, do that address-based sampling push to web, so that we think that we can get kind of a more representative sample than maybe just phone polls or maybe just web polls we're able to capture. So there are a lot of things going into this, but I don't think that it is just a now problem. It's kind of something that's been on the horizon for a while. But please add to that or contradict me. It's totally fine.
Well, no, the only thing I was going to add is specifically you can think about like public opinion polling, which is what Pew does, which is super important in its own way. And then there's polling, which is like predicting the outcome of an election, which is really important in its own way, but very different, right? And I think that there's going to be a reckoning that needs to come with the polling industry. Based on how 2020 went. I don't know whether it's about, my guess would be it has to do with people's likely voter models more than anything else, like figuring out whether or not people are going to vote when they say they're going to vote. I don't have an answer to how to fix that. And I'm not 100% sure that that's the problem, but it is a problem. If we want to have an industry, if we want to have an industry where we are predicting the outcomes of elections, which is not what Pew is in the business of, then that entire industry needs to rethink things. Because even if Biden wins, this is not a win for the polling industry, given what the polls look like the day before the election.
Right. Michele, we have a question here asking that maybe you would please show the slide about the aging of different religious groups. Again, that would be a gentleman named Gordon Clanton would like to see that again. So I'd like to turn as well. Thank you so much, Michele, in advance. I'd like to turn to a question that's framed up specifically for Gerardo from a colleague of ours in Sweden. So thank you for being here all the way from Sweden. He is asking, Per-Erik Nilsson is asking, whether or not you maybe could develop a little bit on the difference between, or the convergences between, political orientation and religious orientation among evangelicals. And the way he frames it is to ask, are there explicit theological reflections on these issues amongst these groups, for example, regarding the two kingdoms doctrine? Or is it a more empirical? So is it, yeah.
Yeah, I've been very interested in the notion of theology and how it plays into these groups. When I look at them, when I read their talk, when I hear their sermons, and when I see them talk to each other, I find a fully inconsistent theology. There are many ways of approaching things. Ultimately, they want to approach it biblically, and I put biblically in quotes because they want it to come back from a sacred text. And they do so more than trying to pull on a theological tradition. But the way they do it ends up being sort of like they pull here every now and then they go this way and that way. And the closest parallel that I have is the reading that I've done on the support for slavery among Christians. When you look at the biblical arguments for slavery, it is shocking how they work with scripture in order to make this argument, okay? And those who were on the other side also pulled some very clever arguments from the scriptures. But I would say that if you were trying to do the plain teaching of scripture, slavery is much easier to defend than some form of abolition. And so when I looked at that, I found it very instructive that it seemed like the commitment to slavery, whether it was economically or through some sense of the white man's republic or others, that drove the exegesis more so than somehow coming to a blank page that had a neutral or objective sort of truth value to it. So when we look then at evangelicals today, I believe that evangelicals really do not have a political theology. They don't have anything really to draw on. It's very weak. And so what they do is they work with the institutionalized narratives that are available to them from partisan outlets. And the partisan outlets then get filtered through something that makes it more or less biblical in order to make it happen. But let me tell you, Paula White, who was mentioned earlier, on the one hand, she says we need to trust God because it's preordained. On the other side, she said we need to overturn the will of man. So, you know, you have all kinds of contradictory arguments being made in support of the outcome they want to make. And so I don't think that the theological arguments that I see, I'm not taking them very seriously. But I would love to see more concerted effort among those who are doing this work to be able to more carefully and more responsibly think through how does politics relate to our faith, and taking faith seriously, as well as the engagement with the politics as they stand today, not assuming that the president is a king or that we somehow live under a monarchy, which is clearly not true. We need new theology to be able to deal with the politics of the moment.
Looking ahead to we're starting to run out of time, which is so disappointing. I could do this all day, but I'm sure the rest of you, right, you've got other things to do. But I wanted to point to the two things I think that we should still hit on from the question and answer. And one of those is, what about, and this is a kind of a broad interpretation of Gladys Gagno's question, which is there a religious left? This is a question I myself have been spinning in my mind about for a long time, and you know, have wanted to write more about, but it's challenging, obviously, as can be. Is there an evangelical left? Is there any evidence of anything pointing in that direction, or being pointed at from a left-leaning direction? The other piece is has to do with COVID, right? Does COVID enter into this equation in any meaningful way? Religion, preference for Biden or Trump, or is there perhaps in the evangelical community a sense of God will protect us? We don't need human-made, you know, we don't need masks, we don't need this, we don't need that, because we're faithful and God will provide. So that's the agenda set.
So I'll take on the COVID, and I think the short answer to this, and I'm going to share some slides. The short answer to this is people adopt their party and they just kind of toe the party line. So let me, okay, so you can see here, this is most important issue. And you could see here, white evangelicals, 7% of them said it was COVID. So not very many. The overwhelming majority said the economy. You could also critique the response options, that maybe none are great for certain groups of religious individuals, but they certainly weren't picking COVID. People in Georgia in general weren't picking COVID, whereas this was a very commonly chosen option in other states. But then this is a question that was basically, you know, kind of one of those, pick which one is more important to you. They can both be important, but if you have to put your money where your mouth is, are you more concerned about containing the spread of COVID or rebuilding the economy? And you can see here that in Georgia as a whole, there's a slight increase, a slight support for containing the spread of COVID. But when you look, you see that that is completely driven by the African-American community. We also know that underrepresented minorities and people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds were also disproportionately affected by COVID. So this might be a political thing. This might be a practical who's affected. But you can see it's 3/4 of African Americans, both evangelical and non-evangelical, say that containing the spread of COVID is more important than rebuilding the economy. That is not the case for white evangelicals. Right, white evangelicals, more than 2/3 say that rebuilding the economy is more important. So, and then again, this white non-evangelical group is kind of in this middle. They look like the state as a whole. Well, they don't quite look like white evangelicals, but they are also a far cry from kind of the non-white community. And so to me, the white evangelicals just are taking the position of the Republicans, right? Or I should say that in Trump in particular, that this is sort of overblown. What matters is we need to get people back doing things, back in person, rebuilding the economy, that it's not about health and safety. And so that seems like this is just completely comports. If we just broke it down by Democrat, Republican, this is what we would see, that this is just the Republican line. And so it doesn't seem like COVID was picking off otherwise kind of evangelical Republican Trump supporters. They're just kind of adopting a policy on COVID that comports with their pre-existing views on their other issue attitudes and their party preference. I will stop sharing.
To build on Michelle's point, I believe, and I'm going to strongly speculate here, that there is a strong affinity between those who pressed for the opening of the economy and those who pressed for the opening of their churches. And so here I think that we see, again, evidence of the melding of a Christian libertarianism, and that Christian libertarianism is leading to attitudes that support this idea of a free market, a business affirming, asset affirming kind of economy, at the same time that their religious orientations are leading them to individualize risk and other things like that. So I think that that's quite important. And they happen to be the strongest element of evangelicalism. So when Gladys and others ask about, is there a religious left? Joseph Baker and I wrote a brief editor's note for Sociology of Religion, the journal, that shows that evidence for the religious left is really pretty small. It doesn't seem to be growing, although some may dispute that. And instead, the imperatives for the left are being carried by those who express that they have no religious affiliation at all. Of course, the trick in the whole thing is that from the work that Gladys and I have done on emerging Christianity, whether they have that label or not, is that many people have exited evangelicalism, even though they are still religious. So they may appear as people who on surveys don't have a religious orientation, but actually they have an ex-religious orientation and have picked up progressive attitudes and actions in relation with that exit. So part of rejecting their conservative Christianity was in part being able to pick up these political imperatives that had been denied them for so long.
I would jump in on that because I think that's a really good point that you made. And I can't obviously speak to who is becoming, well, in here, I can't really speak to who is becoming unaffiliated or who is shedding these religious labels. But I think part of what you bring up is a really important part, that people who say they're nothing in particular are not inherently non-religious. We know for a fact that these are people who say religion is important to them, who might still say that they have a belief in God or universal spirit, that they might even still attend religious worship services. So it's very possible that this group is kind of encompassing some of the, I'm not this anymore, but I don't really know what I am. And that's kind of, it's not the whole group. It's not even an official definition of the group by any means, but it is important to kind of keep in mind what that particular group does encompass. And I would also add to Michelle's point about kind of these priorities and who you're voting for the COVID. We did do another pre-election survey much earlier. So this is kind of the end of August one. And we did ask about what are the priorities for you? What are the issue priorities when you're voting? And we did see those very same splits that among registered voters who are evangelical Protestants, just 39% said that the coronavirus outbreak was a very important issue and who they were going to vote for in November. Meanwhile, 87% of Black Protestants, 60% of white Catholics, 75% Hispanic Catholics, these groups are much higher in the share who say that this was a very important part of their vote. So I think a lot of that is tracking with both the pre-election polling and it looks like what you all are seeing in the exit polls.
Anybody want to have a last word? Because unfortunately we are out of time. It seems to me that we have a whole lot of good work to do. Interesting work.
I only wish we would have had more time to talk about African Americans. I think that politically, that's the thing that we really need to learn more about, and the relationship between religion and advocacy. Yes.
Yes. I would just like to thank from the bottom of my heart, our panelists for being here with us today to talk about something so important, something so relevant. And I hope that, and we're sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. I'm hoping that all of you got something meaningful out of this, that it will help you process what we're seeing happening around the election, and that it will also stimulate you in your research and teaching as well. So my thanks to Dr. Sciupac, Dr. Martí, Dr. Margolis, and for SSSR, I'm Laura Olson. I hope that you'll all be safe and well. Thanks.